All right, welcome back, guys. Now, in the last lesson, we wrote some code that allowed our server to contact Bitcoin Average's servers. We made a request for the data that they have on the current price of Bitcoins in US dollars. And we got back a successful response. And we got back a bunch of data that looks something like this. Now, this data is structured in a format known as a JSON. Now, we've been viewing it so far as pretty much just as a string inside our console, but you can actually also view it inside the browser. So, for example, if I take this URL and instead of making the request from my server, I can instead make the request from my browser. And you can see that the Chrome browser, as with all other browsers, are able to talk to the server, make the GET request, and bring back all of this data. Now, the data we get back from Bitcoin Average's servers is in a data format known as JSON. This is basically a data interchange format. It makes it easier for servers to talk to each other on the internet and get data in a standardized format. So most programming languages are standardized in English, for example. So if you were to write Java code or Swift code or JavaScript code, all of the key words are written in English. And this is so that programmers can talk to each other and they can understand each other. And this is exactly the same for why we use JSONs. By keeping to a standardized format that we use to structure our data, it makes it much easier for website servers to talk to each other and exchange data in the same format. Now, the word JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and that's because JSON data looks extremely similar to JavaScript objects that we've been using. The data is basically formatted in a key and value pair. So the key is kind of similar to the variable name that we've been using, and each key value pair will store a piece of data. Now, as you can see here, JSON data can be really easily nested. You can have a bunch of key value pairs that act as the value to another key value pair. So for example, in this case, we've got a key called averages. And inside averages, we've got 3 key value pairs: the day average, the week average, and the month average of the Bitcoin price. So this is an extremely flexible way of representing data. And its adaptability and flexibility has made it one of the most popular data interchange formats. But of course, it's not the only format. Another one you might come across in the wild is something called XML, and that stands for the Extensible Markup Language format. And here I'm on the Yahoo Weather API that is able to fetch live weather forecasts, and you can see that you can choose to have your responses in a JSON format or an XML format. Now, you'll find the XML format to be really familiar because this looks pretty similar to our HTML tags, where the key is the name of the tag and the value is the data that's contained in between the open and closing tags. But it's usually much longer to read and write, and it's not as easy to work with. So most people will prefer JSON over XML. And in fact, most public APIs you will come across in the wild will use the JSON format as the default format. Now, if you're interested in some of the further intricacies between what is the difference between JSON versus XML, I've included a link in the resources of this lesson that points to a W3 Schools article where they compare JSONs and XML data formats. So you can take a look at that if you're interested. Now, let's see how we would create a new JSON object. Let's say that you went to your local IKEA, any other furniture store for that fact. I've been spending a lot of time in IKEA, so it's literally all I can think about at the moment. But let's say you go into your furniture store and you want to buy a wardrobe. Now, in the showrooms, obviously all the wardrobes are ready made and you can see and feel and play around with it just to decide whether if you want to buy it. Now, in this state, it's kind of the equivalent of having a JavaScript object. It's an actual object. So we can create JavaScript objects as you might remember, by using the var keyword, and then we give the object a name, and then we set the value to a number of properties and methods. So in this case, we have our wardrobe object, which has 2 doors, 2 drawers, and the color is red. Now, once you've bought this wardrobe and you want to take it home, I don't know how many cars can fit an actual wardrobe. So as in the case of IKEA, you would instead buy it as a flat pack. And this is equivalent to converting our JavaScript object into a piece of JSON data. So you can see it's a lot flatter, it's a lot shorter, and it's much easier to carry around, be it in your car or over the internet. Now, once you've gotten home, you'll need to reassemble your wardrobe so that it goes back to the original state. And we can convert JSON data easily back into JavaScript objects. So let's take a look at how we would do all of that in practice. So I'm inside the Chrome Developer Tools and I've got my console open. Now I'm going to create our new object called wardrobe, and it's going to be exactly as we had it before, which is going to be 2 doors, 2 drawers, and the color is going to be red. All right, so now that we've got our wardrobe object, let's hit enter to create it. And now that I have my object, I can use a JavaScript method called stringify. And this will turn our wardrobe object from a JavaScript object into a JSON object. So now you can see the output is our JSON, and this is what it looks like. It's completely flat packed, and it's low on number of characters, and it's short and sweet and easy to transport around over the internet. So what happens once you receive this data, just as in our case when we received our Bitcoin data? Instead of just simply executing this and viewing it, let's store this in a variable. And let's call this JSON wardrobe. Now let's hit enter, and we have access to our JSON wardrobe, which is exactly the same as before. So once we receive this data from the external source, then we can convert it back into its original form as a JavaScript object by simply writing json.parse. So we're going to use the parse method in order to turn this flat pack wardrobe back into the original form, which is our JSON object. If only IKEA was as quick and as simple. Up to this point, we've only been visualizing our JSONs as these strings inside the console. And as the data gets more complex and we get more data back from our external sources, this can be extremely difficult to visualize. So instead of making the request to Bitcoin Averages servers from our server or from our computer, we can also make that request from our browser. So just by putting in that URL that we want to make the GET request to, we end up with our JSON data represented as a string in our browser. Now, you might ask, well, that hasn't really changed very much, right? What's the difference? Well, once you see it in the browser, you can install extensions. For example, I've just activated my JSON Viewer Awesome extension. So now if I refresh this page, you can see that I can view all of that data we get back in a nicely formatted tree structure. And I can look through my data, expand and collapse each individual node so that I can understand the data that I'm getting back a lot easier. Now, this is a really cool tool to install, and it's highly, highly recommended. So if you want to install it, just head over to the Chrome Web Store and add this JSON Viewer Awesome to Chrome. It's completely free and it's safe to use. So now that we can see our data in a tree format, let's see how we can traverse the tree and grab the pieces of data that we need. So there's a number of prices that we're getting back for the current price of Bitcoin. For example, there's the asking price, the bidding price, the last price, the high price, the low price. So the one that I'm going to choose is the last price. So in order to tap into this value here, All I have to do is to convert this JSON data into a JavaScript object, and then I can tap into this key called last. So if we head into Atom, and instead of console logging the body, I'm going to create a variable that is going to store the data that we get back from the Bitcoin averages servers. And in order to convert it from the Flatpak JSON format into a JavaScript object, I'm going to use the method called parse. And inside the parentheses, I'm going to place my JSON data, which is of course the body. And once I have that, I can use it to create my price variable, which is going to be data dot, and the key that I want is last. So I'm going to say data dot last. And that should give me the price that is associated with the last key. So now let's log this price instead of just the body and see what we get. So we're on our local host 3000, and I'm going to click check, and then I'm going to go inside my console, and you can see that we've got this value 7900 come back, which is the last price of Bitcoin. You can see that just as I've been talking, the price of Bitcoin has gone up by $20. So I guess the moral of the story is do less talking and buy more Bitcoins. Now, sometimes you might forget to convert your JSON data into a JavaScript object. So I just want to show you what happens when you do that. So if instead of parsing our JSON object and turning it into this data, we simply straight up try to grab the value stored in the last key in the body, then we will get an error. And the error that we get looks something like this. It will say that it is undefined. It doesn't know what it is. It doesn't have a value that's associated with that particular key. So always be careful when you're working with JSONs, and remember to parse it into a JavaScript object that you can work with. Now, the next thing that you might wonder is, this one was kind of easy to get because it was at the very root of our JSON object. Now, what if I wanted something that was nested? Say, what if I wanted the week average of the price of Bitcoin? Then I would have to somehow navigate into this nested value. The JSON viewer actually comes with a neat tool. So if you click on this and you hover over this green icon, you can actually copy the path. And if I just paste it in here, you can see the path is averages.week. Whereas if I clicked on last and I copied the path here, then it's simply just last. So if you wanted the week average instead of just the last value, then you can simply write, then you can simply copy this path and paste it in here. So data.averages.week will traverse our tree going into here, then going into this week, and then getting us that value. So let's see if that worked. Let's hit save and let's refresh and press our button again. And you can see we get 8484, which is pretty much our weekly average for Bitcoin. All right, so now that we know how to work with our JSON data that we get back from Bitcoin Averages servers, next comes a challenge for you. Can you change the code to send back the price result as a concatenated string? So I want to be able to press on this button, and I want the price to be sent back through an H1 and rendered on our website. And maybe you can do a better job than I did with the spacing as well. So pause the video now and see if you can achieve this. All right, so this shouldn't be too hard. We know that in order to send a response back from our server to the browser, we have to use res.send. And what we're going to send in this case is going to be an H1. So we're going to write H1, and we're also going to have a closing tag for our H1. Now, in between those tags are going to be some text, namely the current price of Bitcoin is, and then we're going to have a space, and then I'm going to concatenate the price variable. And notice that I've changed this price back to our data.last to get the last price instead of the weekly average. You can feel free to pick and choose whichever price you want. And finally, I'm going to put the US dollars at the end so that it will read something like the current price of Bitcoin is something US dollars. So let's hit save and let's check it out. If I press check, then we get this sent back. All right, looking pretty good. Now, here's the next problem. At the moment, we're not really taking into account what the user is selecting in these drop-down menus, right? What if I wanted the price of Litecoins in pounds? This is still going to give me price of Bitcoin. So notice that if you take a look at the Bitcoin Average API documentation, that it says that you can get the current price of any of their supported cryptocurrencies just by changing that last part of the URL. So if you wanted Ethereum to USD, then you would write ETH USD at the back here. If you wanted Litecoins in euros, then you would say LTC EUR. So we already know how to use body parser in order to get back the option that the user selected. Can you figure out a way of changing this last bit of the URL so that it takes into account what the user selected on the website? And then if you can send back the value, instead of just hard coding Bitcoin, tell them what was the name of the cryptocurrency that was chosen and what was the name of the fiat currency that was chosen. So that the next time that you load up your website, you should be able to choose any of these combinations, say from Ethereum to euros. Let's click check, and you should be able to send back, for example, the current price of Ethereum is 525 euros. So pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so we know that we can get the values that are contained inside these drop-down menus by tapping into the request.body.crypto or request.body.fiat. So let's create two variables. One we'll call crypto, and this is going to be equal to request.body.crypto. And the second one is going to be called fiat, and this is going to be request.body.fiat. And these two variables will hold the values that the user chose from the drop-down menu. Now, the next thing we need to do is to concatenate these two values together and then add it to this URL. So instead of having this long URL in here, let's instead have a variable that holds a base URL. And we can set it to everything but the last part. And then let's create a final URL. And this is going to be the concatenated URL. So we're going to use the base URL plus the crypto that the user chose, plus the symbol of the fiat that they chose. So this final URL will now be dynamic, and it will change this last part depending on what the user chose. So now, instead of putting in this string, we can simply write final URL. And once we get our data back, instead of writing the current price of Bitcoin is, well, we can actually add whatever it is that the user chose. So we can say the current price of a particular crypto is, and then we have the price, which will remain the same, which is the last price that we got back from the data. And then finally, we're going to add the fiat currency that the user chose. So now we're sending back an H1 that says the current price of the crypto that you chose is this price in the currency that you chose. So let's save it and let's give this a spin. So let's choose Litecoins in pounds. You can see that Litecoins are worth very little in pounds. So the current price of LTC is £92. Now, we know that we get back quite a lot of data from the Bitcoin averages servers when we make our requests. Now, how can we send the browser more than one response? Because if you try to do 2 res.sends, some of you might have tried this, you'll realize that it doesn't work. It doesn't let you do that. And that's because once you write res.send, that's the end of the sending. That's the last thing you're going to do. So if you wanted to send more than one thing to the browser, you have to instead use something called res.write. So we're going to write to a temporary storage, and once we're done with all the writing, then we'll call res.send. So the first thing that I want to write is I want to get a piece of data that represents the current date. And if you look inside our data set, you can see that we get the current date and time by tapping into this thing called display timestamp. So let's copy the path to display timestamp and let's save it to our current date variable. So now I want to res.write and say the current date is, and then I'm going to append that current date value that we got up here. And then the next thing I want to res.write is going to be what we had in here. So writing 2 items to our temporary store, and then finally we're saying res.send. That's kind of like hitting the send button on your email, and that's it. That's all gone and sent to the browser. And let's just make sure to wrap this first one inside some HTML as well. So we'll put it inside a paragraph element. So now let's check this out. Let's try a new combo, the price of Ethereum in pounds. So now we get the current date is this, and the current price is this. So you can see that we can begin to stack our HTML together and send back a response that contains multi-line HTML to render this web page. All right, so in the next lesson, we're going to see how we can start adding parameters to our external requests. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.